Alright, we're talking about the independent and dependent variables today. We're kind of trying to figure out what is the difference between the two, and how do we find which is the independent and which is the dependent variable. So your learning target is I can identify the independent and dependent variables of a function. So before we get into what an independent and dependent variable really is, let's first determine the relationship between a x and a y given a table. Okay, so in order to do that, in order to determine the relationship between the x and the y values, we need to first find what you would have to add or subtract in order to get from one x value to the corresponding y value. Then, separately, find what you would have to multiply or divide to get from the x to the y. Second step would be to test those remaining values, and third, write an equation based on the information. Okay, so let's go ahead and do that first step here. Let's figure out what do we need to add or subtract to get from x to y. Well, I think it's pretty simple. We could see that we would take our x of 5. We're going to test it using this first set right here. We'd have to subtract 4, and that would give us our 1, right? Alright, now also we could do the other part of that, the multiplication or division part of it. What would we have to multiply or divide by 5 in order to get 1? And we see we'd have to divide by itself. 5 divided by 5. Let me bring this down just a little bit. 5 divided by 5 would give you 1, right? So those are a couple, we're going to see if which one of those works. One of them work, one of them shouldn't work. And if we test this, let's check our next value. If we were to subtract 4 from x, 10 minus 4 does not equal 2. Okay, so we can already see that this whole add or subtract part of things, that's not going to work. The subtracting 4 to get every y value isn't going to work. But if we test it out here with our x value and we divide by 5, 10 divided by 5, that does actually equal 2. And we see 15 divided by 5 does equal 3. Alright? And so we test those remaining values that this one works, not the subtraction. The dividing by 5 works. Therefore, our equation would be y is equal to x divided by 5. We're dividing 5 from every x, and that gives us our y. Okay? Alright, so now let's define what an independent and dependent variable is. The independent variable, that is the input of a function. Okay? The input of a function. I want you to write that down, input of a function. Okay? So essentially what the output depends on. That's the input. Another way to think about the independent variable would be that's your x, or you could also say that's the domain. The x values or the domain values are always the independent variable. The dependent variable is the input of a function. Okay, input. I want you to write down input of a function. That's usually what we are trying to figure out. The dependent variable is usually what we're trying to figure out. So another way we could write this is the y, or the range of a set of values. Okay, so our key concept here, in order to decide which one's independent, which one's dependent, the first thing you're going to want to do is identify the two variables that are unknown, and then second, determine between the two which variable is the independent variable. In other words, which of the two variables needs to be known in order to figure out the other variable. That's probably the easiest way to identify which one's independent and which one's dependent. So let's do a couple examples of that. Example 2, we're supposed to identify the independent and dependent variables in the following situation. And the situation is a painter must measure a room before deciding how much paint to buy. Okay, so we're going to write down those two unknown variables, two unknowns. And we can see here the two things that we don't know is the measurement of the room. We don't know what the measurement of the room is. And we also don't know how much paint we need to buy. Those are the two things that we don't know. Okay? Now remember, in order to figure out which one's the independent variable, okay, which one's the independent variable? Remember, the independent variable is our x. So which of the two variables needs to be known in order to figure out the other? And we know that we need to know how the measurement of the room in order to know how much paint to buy. Therefore, the measurement of the room would be our independent variable, our x, okay, which means that the paint to buy would be our dependent variable. Okay, let's do example 2. 3. So for example 3, again, we're going to start out with two unknowns. What are the two unknowns? Okay. And the situation here is the height of a candle decreases for every hour it burns. So the two things that we don't know, the first one, why don't you take a second, pause the video, try to come up with the two unknowns and write them here. And if you get them wrong, that's fine, but cross them out. But take a second, try to figure out what are the two unknowns. So our two unknowns you should have put the height of a candle. That's one of the unknowns. And the second unknown is time. Time in hours. Those are the two things that we are not sure about, right? And so to figure out which one's the independent variable is what does everything depend on? What needs to be known in order to figure out the other variable? And we need to know how much time has passed in order to figure out the height of a candle, right? So the time is our independent variable, which makes the height of the candle our dependent variable. Okay, and that's how you solve these types of problems.